The date was October 6, 1941. A column of tanks from the 4th Panzer Division ground to a halt somewhere east of Smolensk, along a road that no longer existed. The road had been on the maps. It was marked in confident, printed ink as a hard-surface highway capable of supporting heavy military traffic. What it was, in reality, was a dirt track that had been absorbing the weight of an entire army group for 3 weeks. Now the autumn rains had come, and the track had dissolved. The lead tank of the column sat motionless, its tracks buried to the hull in black mud that had the consistency and grip of wet concrete. Behind it, stretching back for several miles, idled dozens of other vehicles, all of them waiting, burning fuel they could not replace, consuming hours they could not afford. The driver of that lead tank was a 23-year-old corporal from Bavaria who had crossed into the Soviet Union 4 months earlier, convinced the war in the East would be finished before the leaves turned. He had been told so by his officers. His officers had been told so by their commanders. The commanders had been told so by the operational planners in Berlin, who had constructed an invasion timetable built on assumptions about Soviet weakness, about road conditions, about weather, and about the fundamental nature of the Russian landscape that would prove over the following weeks to be catastrophically wrong. That corporal did not know, sitting in his motionless tank in the October mud, that he was at the beginning of what German soldiers would call the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. If you're just discovering this channel, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. We cover stories like this one, the forgotten human-scale moments where the Second World War turned on details that the history books tend to overlook. He did not know that the weather had just become a combatant in a war that Germany was already losing, even if nobody in the German high command was prepared to admit it. He did not know that the mud swallowing his tank's tracks was only the opening act of a catastrophe that would consume one of the most powerful mechanized formations in human history. If you want to understand what happened to the German army in the East during the autumn and winter of 1941, you have to start before the mud. You have to start with the plan. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was launched on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military operation in the history of warfare. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet frontier along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. They were supported by more than 600,000 motor vehicles, 3,000 tanks, and 700,000 horses. The scale was unprecedented. Nothing in the history of war came close to it. Not Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, not the Allied landings in Normandy 3 years later, not any campaign in the Pacific. Barbarossa was a continental assault, a military operation designed to conquer in a matter of months a nation that covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. The plan was called a blitzkrieg, which translates loosely as lightning war. The concept had worked brilliantly in Poland in 1939 and in France in 1940. Armor and motorized infantry, supported by close air support and preceded by rapid, deep penetrations that bypassed and encircled enemy forces, had crushed both campaigns in weeks. German military planners assumed the same approach would work against the Soviet Union. They had, as it turned out, made a fundamental category error. They confused the campaigns in Poland and France, which were fought over relatively small, densely developed countries with established road networks and temperate climates, with a campaign that would be fought across a landmass the size of a continent, where the road network ranged from poor to non-existent, and where the climate operated according to entirely different rules. The operational plan called for the destruction of the main Soviet forces west of the Dwina and Dnieper rivers within 8 to 10 weeks. After that, the German forces would advance eastward, capturing Moscow, Leningrad, and the industrial regions of Ukraine. The war would be over before the autumn rains came. This timetable was not simply optimistic. It was necessary. The entire operational concept was built around it. Germany could not sustain a prolonged campaign in the East. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, its ability to supply a modern, mechanized army across enormous distances, was already strained to its limits even in the planning stage. The army relied heavily on horse-drawn transport for resupply. The motorized vehicles it possessed were often a patchwork of different manufacturers, making spare parts difficult to standardize. The rail network in the Soviet Union used a wider gauge track than the standard European gauge, meaning German trains could not simply roll east. The tracks had to be converted as the army advanced. Every week beyond the initial timetable added an arithmetic burden to the supply system. Every 100 miles of advance stretched the supply lines further. And every mile of Russian road ground down the vehicles that were the lifeblood of the entire operation. In the summer of 1941, none of this seemed to matter. The advance moved with stunning speed. Army Group Center, the formation charged with the drive toward Moscow, covered enormous ground in the opening weeks, encircling and destroying Soviet armies in operations that generated prisoner counts of staggering proportions. At the battles of Białystok and Minsk in late June and early July, Army Group Center encircled and captured more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers. At Smolensk in August, another 300,000 were taken. The numbers seemed to confirm the German timetable. The Soviet army appeared to be collapsing. What the encirclement numbers concealed was equally important. The Soviet Union was not France. It was not Poland. It was a state with a population of almost 200 million people and an industrial base that had been relocated eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers, during the 1930s. When Soviet armies were destroyed, new armies appeared to replace them. When Soviet equipment was captured or destroyed, new equipment rolled out of factories in the Ural Mountains and western Siberia. The Wehrmacht was destroying formations faster than the Soviet Union could reconstitute them, but only barely, and the margin was narrowing with every passing week. The first delays came in July and August, when Hitler ordered Army Group Center to pause its advance on Moscow and redirect forces north toward Leningrad and south toward Ukraine. The professional German officer corps, men like Field Marshal Fedor von Bock commanding Army Group Center and General Heinz Guderian commanding Panzer Group II, argued strenuously against this decision. Moscow was the communications hub of the entire Soviet rail and road network. Taking Moscow would sever the arteries that held the Soviet war machine together. Every week spent on operations in Ukraine and toward Leningrad was a week taken from the campaign season before the autumn rains came. Hitler overruled them. The Ukraine operation, which resulted in the encirclement and capture of more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers near Kiev in September, was the largest single encirclement in military history. It was also, in the long view, a catastrophic diversion. The weeks it consumed were weeks that Operation Typhoon, the renewed drive on Moscow, could not afford to lose. Typhoon began on September 30th, 1941. The plan called for a massive double encirclement that would destroy the Soviet armies defending Moscow and open the road to the Soviet capital before winter. In the opening phase, it succeeded brilliantly. Two enormous pockets formed around Bryansk and Vyazma, capturing or killing more than 600,000 more Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow seemed open. German propaganda celebrated what appeared to be the decisive final victory in the East. On October 9th, the Nazi Party press secretary Otto Dietrich held a press conference in Berlin and told assembled journalists that the war in the East had been decided, that the last intact Soviet army group standing between the Wehrmacht and Moscow had been destroyed, that the campaign was essentially over. It was one of the most premature announcements in the history of modern warfare. On that same day, it began to rain. The Rasputitsa is a Russian word with no precise equivalent in German or English. It translates roughly as the quagmire season or the time without roads. It occurs twice a year in Russia, once in autumn, when the summer-baked earth becomes saturated with rain, and once in spring when the frozen ground thaws. During the Rasputitsa, roads that appear on maps cease to function as roads. The underlying soil in much of western Russia is a clay-rich composition that, when wet, becomes almost frictionless. Wheels spin, tracks bog down. Vehicles that weigh several tons sink to their axles. Men walking on foot sink to their knees. German military planners knew about the Rasputitsa. It appeared in their intelligence assessments, in the geographical studies prepared before Barbarossa. They had noted it, acknowledged it, and then built their timetable around avoiding it. The invasion was supposed to be over before the rains came. The rains came anyway, and they came in October, earlier and heavier than average for that year. The German Army's senior meteorologist, Dr. Karl Wyss, had warned in a pre-invasion study that rainfall in western Russia during October could render the primary road axes impassable for wheeled vehicles. His estimate was not considered in the final planning. The timetable had no room for bad weather, and so bad weather was not given a serious place in the timetable. This is how catastrophes are built, not in a single dramatic failure of judgment, but in a long series of smaller decisions, each of which seems reasonable in isolation and together produce an outcome that nobody planned for and nobody can stop once it begins. Within days of the Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements, the entire front of Army Group Center began to slow, then stagger, then stop. The roads that German supply columns had been using, already badly degraded by months of heavy traffic, dissolved into rivers of mud. Columns of vehicles that stretched for miles sat stationary, their engines idling, burning irreplaceable fuel while their drivers stared at an impassable landscape. The 4th Panzer Division, part of Panzer Group 4 operating on the northern flank of the Moscow offensive, became one of the most thoroughly documented victims of the Rasputitsa. The division had fought through the summer campaign with considerable success, participating in the enormous encirclements that had defined the early phase of Barbarossa. By October, it had covered more than 1,000 miles since crossing the Soviet frontier in June. Its vehicles were worn, its men were exhausted, its supply situation was already precarious. When the rains came, the division's operational diary, preserved in German military archives, began recording entries that read less like military documents and more like dispatches from a natural disaster. On October 8th, the diary noted that all forward movement had stopped due to road conditions. On October 9th, it recorded that 2 supply trucks had been swallowed by the mud to such a depth that they could not be recovered and had to be abandoned with their loads. On October 12th, it noted that fuel supplies had fallen below minimum operational levels and that combat operations could not be resumed until resupply was received. The resupply did not come because the supply trucks could not move any more than the combat vehicles could. Across Army Group Center's front, the same story repeated in hundreds of variations. The 10th Panzer Division recorded that it had consumed 3 full days trying to move 6 miles. The 2nd Panzer Division lost dozens of vehicles not to Soviet action but to mechanical failure caused by the strain of operating in extreme mud conditions. Horses that the Wehrmacht relied on for supply in areas where motor vehicles could not go were dying by the hundreds, worked to death or broken-legged in the churned mud of what had once been roads. The human cost was invisible in the immediate operational sense but devastating in its cumulative weight. Soldiers who had been marching and fighting since late June had been issued summer uniforms for a campaign that was supposed to end in late summer. They were still wearing those uniforms in October, supplementing them with whatever they could find. Soviet greatcoats stripped from prisoners, civilian clothing taken from abandoned villages, rags wrapped around their boots to replace leather that had worn through. The German army had not issued winter clothing because the planners had not anticipated the army would need it. Winter clothing had been produced, stockpiled in Germany, but the Wehrmacht had not shipped it east because the supply trains were fully occupied with ammunition, fuel, and food. Letters written by German soldiers during October 1941, many of which survived in collections held by the German Military Archive in Freiburg, describe a world in which the physical act of moving had become the primary enemy. One sergeant from the 10th Panzer Division wrote to his wife that they had spent 3 days trying to move a single artillery piece 600 meters, that the horses had been worked until 2 of them simply fell over and died, and that he was not certain what they were supposed to do next. He did not write this in despair. He wrote it with a kind of bewildered exhaustion, the tone of a man who has encountered something he has no frame of reference for. The mud was not an obstacle in the military sense. It was a condition, total and surrounding, that made every action harder, every supply scarcer, every hour of effort return less than it should have. If this kind of detailed, human-scale history resonates with you, please take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about these forgotten stories. Subscribing keeps you connected to every new episode we release. It was into this context that the 4th Panzer Division situation crystallized into something that captured, in miniature, the larger catastrophe engulfing the German Eastern Campaign. The division's Panzer Regiment, its tank force, the core of its fighting power, had entered the Soviet Union in June with a theoretical complement of approximately 200 tanks. By October, through a combination of combat losses, mechanical breakdowns, and the grinding attrition of thousands of miles of rough roads and improvised terrain, the regiment was operating with fewer than 50 functional machines. The tanks that remained were running on improvised maintenance. Spare parts were scarce. The mechanics who kept them running were working under conditions that made any serious repair nearly impossible. These were not abstractions. They were specific machines with specific problems. A tank whose track pins had worn loose needed replacement pins that sat in a supply depot somewhere 200 miles to the west, on the other side of the mud. A tank whose engine had thrown a bearing needed a replacement engine that existed in theory but not in practice at the front. The Germans had designed their logistics system around the assumption of a short campaign. The system was not built to sustain a mechanized army for months in an environment where every mile of road consumed vehicles at 10 times the normal rate. Soviet forces defending the approaches to Moscow were themselves battered, under-equipped, and suffering enormous casualties. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who took command of the Moscow front on October 10 as German forces threatened to break through on multiple axes, later described the situation as desperate. The forces available to him were a mixture of regular army units mauled in the earlier encirclements, hastily formed militia battalions of Moscow factory workers with minimal training, and divisions transferred from the Soviet Far East, where they had been watching the Japanese frontier. None of these forces were in ideal condition, but they had one enormous advantage. They knew the terrain, they could move through it, and their supply lines were short. Zhukov understood something about the Moscow situation that his German counterparts did not fully reckon with. Time was working for him and against them. Every week that passed, every mile the Germans could not advance, shifted the balance. Soviet production in the relocated factories beyond the Urals was accelerating. American and British Lend-Lease material, tanks, trucks, aluminum for aircraft, canned food, was arriving through the Arctic convoys into Murmansk and through Iran. The Soviet Union's capacity to regenerate itself was not infinite, but it was far greater than German intelligence had estimated. Zhukov's job was not to win elegantly. His job was to survive long enough for that regeneration to matter. The Soviet military had been operating in Russian mud for centuries. Their vehicles, the T-34 tank, the trucks supplied under American Lend-Lease, had wider tracks and higher ground clearance than German equivalents, specifically because Soviet engineers had designed them for exactly the conditions German engineers had dismissed. The T-34's wide tracks gave it a ground pressure of roughly 11 pounds per square inch. The German Panzer III, the backbone of the Wehrmacht's tank force in 1941, had a ground pressure of roughly 15 pounds per square inch. That difference of 4 pounds per square inch was the difference between moving and not moving in the October mud of the Moscow approaches. Soviet tanks that could still operate freely faced German tanks that could not move. German senior commanders recognized the crisis, but recognition did not produce solutions. Field Marshal von Bock sent a steady stream of communications to the Army High Command describing the deteriorating situation. General Guderian, whose Panzer group was attempting to drive south of Moscow toward Tula, wrote in his personal diary entries from this period that he had never seen anything like it, that the roads had ceased to exist, that his vehicles were simply disappearing into the landscape. Guderian was not given to exaggeration. He was a precise, professional military mind, the man who had done more than anyone to develop German armor doctrine. His assessments carried weight. The Army High Command responded with instructions to push forward regardless. Moscow had to be taken before winter. The operational logic was undeniable. Moscow was the objective. The campaign could not survive a winter in the field without capturing it. But operational logic and physical reality were operating according to different rules, and physical reality was winning. The October mud slowed the German advance to a crawl, but it did not stop it entirely. In some sectors, German forces found routes that were more passable than others, improvised corduroy roads by cutting timber and laying it across the worst sections, and continued grinding forward. By late October and into November, the mud began to freeze. The Rasputitsa gave way to what soldiers called the iron frost. Temperatures dropping below 0 Fahrenheit, the ground hardening into concrete, the mud solidifying into ruts that could break a vehicle's suspension or snap an axle. Briefly, the German advance resumed. The 4th Panzer Division moved again, covering ground that the mud had denied it for 3 weeks. Then winter arrived in earnest. The winter of 1941–42 was one of the coldest in the recorded history of European Russia. Temperatures in November and December fell to -20, -30, and in some locations, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. This was cold that killed men who fell asleep in exposed positions. Cold that froze the oil in tank engines, making them impossible to start without hours of heating. Cold that shattered metal, cracked rubber, made the mechanisms of rifles and machine guns jam with frozen lubricants. Cold that killed horses, which the Wehrmacht needed for supply. Cold that the German army, still largely in its summer uniforms, was not equipped to survive. Soviet forces had winter clothing. They had felt-lined boots called Valenki, specifically designed for operations in extreme cold. They had padded jackets and trousers. They had established procedures for keeping vehicles operational in sub-zero temperatures, doctrines for fighting in conditions that their grandfathers had faced and their equipment had been designed for. They were not comfortable in the cold, but they could function in it. The German army, by November of 1941, largely could not. By the time the 4th Panzer Division reached its furthest point of advance, the town of Krasnaya Polyana, roughly 15 miles north of Moscow, close enough that soldiers with binoculars claimed they could make out the spires of the Kremlin on clear days, the division was a shadow of the formation that had crossed the frontier in June. Its tank strength had fallen to single digits. Its infantry regiments were at a fraction of their authorized strength, not from spectacular battles but from the accumulated attrition of months of hard campaigning. Its supply situation was critical. Its men were frostbitten, exhausted, and far beyond the range at which the German logistics system could reliably sustain them. The closest German units reached Moscow's outskirts in late November and very early December 1941. Engineers from the 258th Infantry Division reportedly saw the reflected glow of Moscow's lights on the horizon. Officers with maps calculated they were within artillery range of the Soviet capital. It was the high water mark. The tide had already turned before they knew it. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Western Front under Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire Moscow axis. 100 divisions, many of them the fresh, winter-equipped formations transferred from the Far East, struck at German positions that were exhausted, frozen, undersupplied, and holding a line that was too long, too thin, and too far from any possibility of reinforcement. The German units that had been struggling for 6 months to advance now found themselves struggling simply to survive. The question was no longer whether they could take Moscow. The question was whether they could avoid encirclement and destruction. The counteroffensive hit the 4th Panzer Division on its flanks, where adjacent units had been forced back, creating gaps. The division's reduced tank force could not respond to multiple simultaneous threats. Its artillery had been depleted. Its infantry was fighting in temperatures that made sustained combat physically impossible for men without adequate cold-weather equipment. Soldiers described throwing hand grenades that failed to detonate because the fuses had frozen. Rifle bolts froze in the cold and had to be worked open by hand after each shot. Machine gun barrels, normally cooled by air circulation during firing, froze when firing stopped and had to be heated before they could fire again. The retreat began on December 6th. It was not a controlled withdrawal conducted according to a plan. In many sectors it was a rout, conducted under constant Soviet pressure, through temperatures that killed stragglers and the wounded. The German army in the east, which had not prepared any defensive positions because it had not anticipated any need to defend, fell back through the frozen landscape, abandoning equipment it could not move and supplies it could not carry. The images from this period, preserved in German military photographs and in the accounts of soldiers who survived, have a particular quality of unreality. Columns of men wrapped in civilian scarves and women's shawls. Anything that could add insulation against temperatures that the human body was not meant to endure in summer wool. Horses dead in the ditches, frozen into postures that suggested they had simply stopped where they stood. Artillery pieces abandoned in the snow because the horses to pull them were gone and the vehicles to tow them had been swallowed by the mud weeks earlier and never recovered. A modern mechanized army, the product of the most industrially advanced nation in Europe, retreating through a Russian winter in stolen clothing. Hitler, in a decision that military historians have debated ever since, issued his famous halt order on December 18th, forbidding unauthorized withdrawals and demanding that Army Group Center hold its positions in place. His reasoning was not entirely without logic. A disorganized retreat in extreme cold, under Soviet pressure, risked becoming the kind of catastrophic rout that had destroyed Napoleon's army in 1812. Rigid defense, holding supply depots and railheads, might preserve more of the army than a mobile retreat through open country. German generals at the front, including Guderian, argued that the order was militarily insane, that troops could not survive in positions that had no shelter and no supplies. The argument was settled by the relief of the generals who made it. Guderian was dismissed on December 26. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved for health reasons. The commander of Army Group North was relieved. Within 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had removed the officers who had led it to the edge of Moscow and replaced them with men more willing to follow orders that the situation did not support. It was not the last time this pattern would repeat on the Eastern Front. And here, at the moment of German retreat and Soviet counterattack, is the right point to step back and consider what had actually happened, because the story of the German defeat before Moscow in the winter of 1941 is not simply a story of bad weather defeating a good army. It is the story of a plan that contained within it the seeds of its own failure, and of a military culture so confident in its own operational brilliance that it refused to genuinely reckon with the physical realities it faced. The German military in 1941 was arguably the most tactically proficient army in the world. Its officers were educated, aggressive, and empowered with a doctrine of Auftragstaktik mission command that gave junior leaders enormous freedom to act on their own initiative. Its NCOs were experienced and capable. Its soldiers were disciplined and brave. It had won stunning victories against France, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece. It had every reason for the confidence it possessed. But confidence and tactical brilliance could not change the physical facts. Russia was enormous, and the German army was not large enough to conquer it in a single campaign season. The Soviet Union's industrial capacity was located in the east, beyond German reach, and it was producing weapons faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. The Russian climate operated according to rules that German planners had acknowledged but not genuinely incorporated into their planning. And the Soviet soldier, for all the catastrophic defeats the Red Army suffered in the opening months of Barbarossa, would not stop fighting. The losses the 4th Panzer Division suffered during the Rasputitsa and the Soviet winter counteroffensive were not primarily losses to enemy action, though those existed. They were losses to weather, terrain, and the collapse of a logistical system built for a different kind of campaign. When you strip away the operational language, what happened to the 4th Panzer Division, and to Army Group Center more broadly, was this: an army built for speed was stopped by mud, then frozen by cold, then hit by an enemy it had stopped expecting to fight because the plan had assumed the enemy would stop fighting. The plan was wrong. The weather was indifferent, and the cost was paid in German lives. Heinz Guderian, relieved of command in late December 1941 after arguing with Hitler over the conduct of the retreat, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the campaign in Russia had revealed the limits of what mechanized warfare could achieve when the physical environment exceeded the assumptions built into the operational planning. He was careful, in his memoirs, to place much of the blame on Hitler's interference and on logistical failures rather than on the fundamental concept of Barbarossa. Military memoirs written by defeated commanders are not always the most reliable guides to what actually happened. What the evidence in the operational diaries, the unit histories, and the retrospective analyses compiled by German and Soviet historians together suggests is something both simpler and more uncomfortable. The German army attempted something that was beyond its actual capability, sustained by a confidence in its own operational methods that prevented it from honestly assessing the conditions it would face. The mud and the cold were not surprises hidden in secret files. They were facts about Russia that had been known for generations. Napoleon's army had encountered them in 1812. The operational planners of 1941 had the advantage of that precedent and chose, in their planning assumptions, to set it aside. The human consequences of that choice unfolded across hundreds of miles of frozen ground over the winter of 1941 and 42. The Wehrmacht's losses on the Eastern Front during that winter totaled, by German military records, more than 800,000 casualties: killed, wounded, frostbitten, and sick. The 4th Panzer Division, which had entered the Soviet Union in June with approximately 15,000 men, emerged from the winter campaign with a fraction of that strength and would spend months rebuilding before it could operate as a coherent formation again. Across the lines, the Soviet soldiers who had stopped the German advance before Moscow were celebrated as heroes of the defense of the capital. Zhukov was awarded the Order of Lenin. The divisions that had held the line through November and counterattacked in December were given the honorific designation of Guards Formations, a distinction that carried real prestige in the Soviet military hierarchy. Stalin, who had been contemplating evacuating Moscow in mid-October, remained in the capital and used the city's survival as a propaganda asset of enormous value, both domestically and internationally. The battle for Moscow, and the German failure to take it, had consequences that reached far beyond the military situation on the Eastern Front. It demonstrated to the world and to the Soviet population that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. The myth of German military omnipotence, so carefully constructed by the victories of 1939 through 1941, had been punctured, not by a decisive battle in the traditional sense, but by mud, cold, exhaustion, supply failure, and the simple fact that a plan built on optimistic assumptions about an enemy's willingness to collapse had encountered an enemy that would not cooperate with the plan. The strategic implications accumulated over the following years. Germany never again held the operational initiative on the Eastern Front for any sustained period. The summer offensives of 1942 and 1943 were constrained, geographically and logistically, in ways that the original Barbarossa operation had not been. The Red Army learned from its catastrophic defeats of 1941 and rebuilt itself into a force of increasing sophistication and power. The mud and the cold that stopped the German advance before Moscow did not win the war. But they gave the Soviet Union the time it needed. The 4th Panzer Division continued to fight on the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. It participated in the summer offensive toward the Caucasus in 1942, the catastrophic defeat at Kursk in 1943, and the long retreat westward through 1943-44 and into 1945. By the war's end, the division that had stood within binocular range of the Kremlin in the autumn of 1941 was fighting in the rubble of eastern Germany. The men who had driven their tanks to the edge of Moscow were, by then, dead, prisoners, or so few in number that the division retained its designation more as a matter of institutional continuity than operational reality. The Caterpillar D8 bulldozer, as American CB veterans would recognize it, could not help you here. There was no single innovation, no moment of improvised brilliance, no construction worker with a practical solution that cut through the impossible. What stopped the German army before Moscow was something larger and more impersonal. The accumulated weight of physical reality asserting itself against a plan that had refused to fully account for it. Germany's failure before Moscow in 1941 is studied in military academies around the world because it contains lessons that do not age. Every military campaign is built on assumptions about terrain, climate, enemy capability, and logistical sustainability. When those assumptions are correct, even modestly capable forces can achieve ambitious objectives. When they are wrong, when the terrain is harder than expected, the climate more severe, the enemy more resilient, the logistics more strained, then operational brilliance and tactical proficiency are not sufficient compensation. Physics and geography do not negotiate. They simply are what they are. The German soldiers who sat in their frozen tanks in the mud outside Moscow in October and December of 1941 were not fighting only the Red Army. They were fighting a landscape that had been absorbing invaders for centuries. The Rasputitsa had stopped Napoleon's Grande Armée on its retreat in 1812. It stopped the Wehrmacht on its advance in 1941. It made no distinction between French and German, between the 19th century and the 20th, between Napoleon's cavalry and Hitler's panzers. Mud is mud. Cold is cold. And the Russian winter, as countless soldiers across the centuries discovered, does not care about your operational timetable. The corporal from Bavaria, sitting in his motionless tank in the October mud on October 6, 1941, could not have known any of this. He knew his tank was stuck. He knew the road had disappeared. He knew that somewhere ahead, through the gray autumn rain, lay a city he had been told the army would capture within weeks. He did not know that he was at the turning point of the war in the East, that the mud beneath his tracks was the first act of a catastrophe that would consume millions of lives and ultimately determine the outcome of the Second World War. He knew only that he was cold and tired, and that his tank was not moving. In the end, that was enough. If the story of the Eastern Front and the forces that shaped the Second World War resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves history. We exist because of viewers like you who believe these stories deserve to be told carefully and told well. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Our community spans every continent, and hearing from you reminds us why this work matters.